I'm Julia Davis, a film major who stumbled into the business world with no experience in 2006. I was able to fail enough to learn how to run a seven-figure business and have provided consulting services to over 200 individually owned companies. Through this podcast, I hope to provide some perspective on the growth and grit it takes to accomplish big goals and share some hard lessons I've had to learn along the way. Welcome to the Growth and Grit podcast with me, Julia Davis, where we dive into real stories and practical strategies and a lot of encouragement to help you push past obstacles and grow stronger in every season of your business. Before we get started, make sure that you hit the subscribe button so you don't miss an episode. And if today's message inspires you, please share it with a friend or a business owner. Today, we're going to talk about two different types of leadership. One being a reward-focused leadership and another being a responsibility-centered leadership. And where I got this meeting is from a book called The Motive by Lencioni. So if you have not read that book, I highly suggest you do it, especially if you're in a position where you're leading others or developing teams or in charge of some type of business. This is a really great book to kind of get your head in the right position of how to lead people really, really well. So I'm going to break this down in a few different categories as far as, different types of leadership goes. So when I'm talking about reward-centered leadership, it's a view on leadership where people think leading is actually a personal reward, and it focuses on status, on power, privilege. And I'll use an example of what this is like, but the opposite of that is responsibility-centered leadership. And a responsibility-centered leader sees leadership as a duty to serve others and embraces difficult, often thankless tasks that leadership involves. And effective leadership stems from more of a responsibility-centered motive, as leaders driven by responsibility are more likely to focus on developing teams, managing people, having difficult conversations, running effective meetings, communicating, and it leads to greater organizational health in your business. So I'm going to break down the two different aspects, one being reward-centered leadership and one being responsibility-centered. So in a reward-centered leadership position, the motivation for that leader is typically they're pursuing a leadership role for their personal benefit, like status, power, money, control, something like that. And if you have that type of motivation because you want to lead to make more money or be in control or have power or whatever it is, the problem with that is that you'll only get to a certain level before you'll kind of fizzle out. Where on the opposite end, a responsibility-centered leader, their motivation is driven by a profound sense of duty, right? A sense of duty to serve their team, to protect and improve the lives of their people and to create a positive impact. So it's more like this altruistic thinking, like I have a responsibility to people and a business and clients to do my job. So they work at a different level than the reward-centered leader, which is kind of like, what's in it for me type of mentality. The second thing, I'm going back and forth between the two here. So the second thing is under a reward-centered leadership type of model, the view of leadership is they think of leadership as a reward earned for past hard work. And a position should be enjoyed, not a burden. So they look at leadership like, I worked really hard. I deserve to be in this leadership role, and I should be able to enjoy my role and my position, and it shouldn't be unpleasant in any way. And when it is unpleasant, they don't like it. So they're like, this should be fun. This should be something that I should get this position because I worked so hard to obtain this role. So this should be where I am. Where a responsibility-centered leader, they look at leadership as a challenge, right? They're like, this is an honorable and challenging opportunity that requires a deep commitment to serve, right? So a responsibility-centered person is going to think about what can I do to help everybody and be a team player and make sure I'm an asset to my own team, where a reward-centered leader is going to look at it and say, I deserve to be a leader. This is something that I worked really hard for, and it should not be challenging at all. We see this all the time in athletics, right? Where we see like a college quarterback who is unbelievable get drafted by a team and they fizzle out, right? Almost immediately, maybe within the first season or first few months of taking part in that team, they completely fizzle out and don't do well. We see other quarterbacks, maybe they come from community colleges or somewhere that have had to grind and try and work really hard. We see them go into the NFL and become unbelievable quarterbacks. So this happens all the time, right? Where someone gets drafted and they're like, hey, I'm going to party. I'm going to spend all this money that I've already made. I worked so hard to earn this opportunity. I'm going to blow all this money on cars and whatever. And they show up at training camp and just get their butts kicked. That's the reward centered leader, right? A responsibility centered leader gets the draft is like, okay, I'm drafted to this team. They go there, they find an apartment, they start working out, they start meeting the team, they start working extra hard as a responsibility to that team. They show up at training camp totally prepared and crush it. It's just two different types of mentality of people. So that's their view on leadership. The third thing, it leads to behavior. So the behavior of a reward centered leader often delegates unpleasant tasks. So the second that they don't want to do something or they think something isn't fun, they're going to delegate it to somebody else. They delegate mundane things, difficult things, unpleasant things. They often neglect like really crucial leadership responsibilities because they just don't want to do them. So they just pawn them off on other people. A responsibility centered leader embraces the essential tasks that it needs to run a business. So they are developing teams themselves. They're usually doing the hard stuff themselves. They're having difficult conversations with clarity and speed. They're saying, hey, this is a problem. We need to fix this because they genuinely care about the health of the business. They're running focused and engaging meetings. They're communicating frequently with their team. So they're just really hands-on. Looking at how they run a business and their responsibility to their team is so vital and crucial and important that they need to make sure that they are hands-on doing that. Where a reward-centered leader is the king or queen of delegation. They're like, oh, you handle this, you do this, you do this, you do this. It usually gets done poorly and it falls back on them and then they get mad because they have a big mess to clean up, but they didn't want to do it in the first place. So, that's another negative. And the consequences of this type of leadership, a reward centered leader typically runs a very more low morale business. They don't have a lot of teamwork. There's a lot of negative consequences of not having, proper communication and conversations. Usually it's due to neglect of core responsibilities. So a reward centered leader's business typically fizzles out. And usually what a reward centered leader will do is point the finger at other people. They'll be like, well, you didn't train me properly, or you didn't do this, or you didn't do that. When in reality, it was just the mentality of the leader was so poor and broken that they really just didn't run a good business. But instead of taking accountability for that and saying, hey, I could have done all these things better or different, they say, well, it's this person's fault. It's that person's fault because they delegated so much probably that it might have been, but they should have really just taken control of their own scenario. The consequences of running a responsibility centered leadership type of business is it's usually a really healthy organization. If it focuses on the needs of people and long-term growth, then the health of the company continues to thrive usually and grow. And one of my favorite quotes that I read in this book, I'm going to read it. It says, a leader's underlying motive, whether reward or responsibility, profoundly influences their behavior and decision making. Leaders who are genuinely responsibility centered are more likely to achieve long-term success because their focus is on the welfare of their team and organization and not on personal gain. So if somebody is running a business based on their own personal gain, the chances of that business being successful is far lower than somebody who runs a business focusing on how can I help people become better? How can I help the organization? How can I help the client? Really kind of like an outward thinking model versus an inward thinking model. So if you're listening to this meeting and you're like, man, I probably fall a little bit more on the reward centered side. Okay. But try to fix and adjust the way that you're thinking on that. And if you fall more on the responsibility centered side, you're really on the right track. But I would say human nature puts us more on the reward centered side. Most people are, because they're just like, what's in it for me? What's in it for me? But if you want to run a business and a really healthy organization, you have to make sure that at some point your mind changes to what's best for the team. And all the tough stuff needs to fall on the leadership person because they are the most accountable and should be the most accountable for their business. So if you love this podcast and you think it could help others, please share it. With friends, with business owners, with people who lead and manage and develop teams. That's how we can get this message out there to people. And hopefully we can build and develop a lot of responsibility-centered leaders. Thanks so much for watching.